War of 1812, the Forgotten War, is full of untold stories lost within names and dates. It was those fighting on the battlefield daily that shaped the war as we know it today. We often dismiss the significant roles many groups played in the war, not realizing the impact they had in defining both Canada and the United States. Many groups of people from a variety of ethnic backgrounds encountered many of the same hardships and devastation. All along the coast of the Great Lakes stands a series of empty structures that once housed a vibrant society of people who, through difficult times, determined what it was like to live life beyond the field. Americans declared war on Upper Canada on June 18, 1812. They did so based on a number of issues that were weakening the already fragile relationship between America and Britain. The animosity found its way onto the high seas, where sailors were being taken from American ships sailing across the Atlantic Ocean and forced to work on British vessels. At the same time, a trade blockade was crippling the American trade to France, a former ally from the time of American Revolution.
The reasons for the United States declaring war on Great Britain had to do with an expression of American sovereignty. America was a new nation. And just before the War of 1812 broke out, Britain was in a death struggle with Napoleon on the continent of Europe. And in trying to prevent neutral nations from bringing supplies to Napoleon, the British were stopping the ships of neutral nations on the high seas and trying to ensure that contraband wasn't getting to Napoleon's army. And anytime they encountered an American sailor with a British accent, they assumed that he was a British subject and therefore liable to be impressed into the Royal Navy. The other reason for the declaration of war is that after the American Revolution, the Americans were expanding westward into the Ohio Valley. And in so doing, they were dispossessing the Ohio Aboriginal nations, driving them west, and of course getting into conflicts with the Aboriginal peoples. The British were siding with the Aboriginal peoples, providing them with arms and advice and to some extent with leadership and so on. And the Americans felt that was a violation of their sovereignty and their westward expansions.
The biggest group fighting with the British was led by Tecumseh and his half-brother, the religious prophet Tenskwatawa. From their experiences, they realized that American expansion posed a threat to annihilating the Aboriginal people and their ways of life. The natives called for a unified Aboriginal Confederacy as a way to fortify the Aboriginal race in North America against the white settlers' continual lust for land.
As for natives, they're the one group that I'm really interested in the War of 1812 because it's just so tragic. You know, without them, this would not be Canada. And you get the short end of the stick from everybody.
I think when you think about Native people in the War of 1812, a couple points are really important. One is the fact that they played an absolutely critical role to Canadian defense. It's hard to imagine Canada surviving the War of 1812 without the Native Alliance. That's important. Another key thing is to remember that the different Native peoples in different parts of the Great Lakes had different reasons for fighting, but the biggest group, the people who formed around Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, who were so important for Canadian defense, did not achieve their objectives of carving out an independent Native homeland, so there's great tragedy there for them. Often you get propagandistic history, particularly in the United States, that speaks of sort of bloodthirsty savages and all that cant that has no serious validity in history. Or you get people referring to Native people as red pawns of the two white powers, forgetting that, in fact, the Native population had their own objectives in the war, and they formed their alliances with considerable diplomatic skill to achieve those objectives.
I think there's also a sense that they didn't know what was going on. But we know from the communications and the oral history that they knew exactly what was going on. The average Grand River Six Nations gentleman living not far from here can probably read and write in English. And he probably speaks a number of native dialects as well. The average white North American could not read or write. So you have to be very careful who you called uncivilized back then.
At the time of America declaring war, there were many British loyalists living in Upper Canada. These loyalists, however residing in Upper Canada, remained loyal to the British Crown because many had left Britain to overpopulation and wished to recreate Britain in North America.
A lot of people who lived in Canada who were actually loyalists, who had come to Canada to stay loyal to the British Crown. And a lot of Americans felt that those loyalists, because they were basically all, Americans, and the loyalists and the British who were here had all been kind of the same group of people before the war, or before the American Revolution. A lot of Americans felt that those loyalists would decide to fight for the Americans while they were here, or not fight for the British, which was kind of the important thing, that they would just remain neutral during the war. And that did happen to some extent, but it was underestimated. In the end, a lot of those loyalists did go and fight for the British because that's why they came here in the first place. They wanted to be in a country that was British.
Another significant group in the War of 1812 were known as the War Hawks. The War Hawks, led by the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, were a group of congressmen from the Midwest who were concerned with Britain's alliance with the natives, as well as fighting against British imperialism. They largely supported the war against Great Britain.
The War Hawks is a nickname, obviously, for a group of American politicians who were just kind of itching for a war with Great Britain, right? And the main reason why, and this is, I guess, a benefit for the United States at the time, was that they wanted to kind of prove to the world the United States wasn't some colony, that it was a country. Because the mentality of people throughout the world regarding the United States, or the opinion I should say, was that it wasn't a real country. People still don't call them Americans, they were colonists.
Well, the War Hawks were primarily major landowners and land speculators from Kentucky and from the Ohio Valley. They were in the very areas that this whole conflict with the Aboriginal peoples, where that was taking place. They firmly believed, the War Hawks, that by conquering Britain in Canada, you would end this sphere of British influence on the Aboriginal peoples and make the dispossession of the Aboriginal peoples that much easier. So the War Hawks really pushed the President of the United States and Congress to declare war, and they controlled Congress more or less by 1812.
Native people were motivated to participate in the war largely for native reasons, and the British and the natives had a common enemy in the United States, so it was natural for them to form an alliance. Between native groups, you get people based largely on geography aligning with one white power or another, or deciding to stay neutral.
What they wanted was neutrality. They wanted to be left alone for the most part. But just the press of European immigration to North America was not going to allow that.
It's the lesser of two evils. Right? If you stay neutral, you have to worry about two armies coming in, burning your village, taking all your stuff and leaving. If you pick a side, you have to worry about one army coming in, burning your village, so you don't have a choice in the matter.
Due to the efforts of the War Hawks and other political causes, President James Madison was influenced to declare war against Great Britain on June 12, 1812. He then ordered the American army to march north to conquer the British in North America.
The Americans have a regular army that should be in the neighborhood of about 15,000 troops. They have a very small navy, but you don't really need a navy to take over Canada. You just march north. They have massive numbers of militiamen that could field potentially tens of thousands of part-time citizen soldiers. And confronting them is about 6,000 British regulars, but when we say British regulars, even some of them are full-time Canadian troops. Many of the men who had been junior officers in the Revolutionary War, in fact, did not see a lot of battle in that war. But when you signed on with the US Army, you were given many of the same incentives that a British soldier had, but even better, because the standard of living is a little better in North America. More people own their own land. So an American soldier, when he enlists, is offered as much as $100 in bounty, and eventually 160 acres of land once he's done his service. And he only has to serve the duration of the war, for 10 years, whichever comes first, to gain that. So there was this sense perpetuated by politicians who hadn't done a lot of service in the Revolution to say, listen, you take some motivated citizens, give them some guns, you're going to liberate the people in Canada, this is going to be easy.
The life of an average soldier was very regimented. The soldiers would be up every hour before the sunrise every day. Soldiers were responsible for keeping their kits in proper order, making sure their barracks were clean, and treating their uniforms with proper respect. Disobedience was not taken lightly.
So if a soldier was stationed here at Fort George, he would be sleeping in the barracks at Fort George. He wouldn't be allowed to rent quarters in the town or whatever. A soldier could get a pass to go into town. He could even get a pass to go to another town or another city if he had a very good reason for doing it. And it was only the most trusted soldiers that were allowed to go into town because, again, they were concerned with the problem of desertion. They're given a bounty for joining. They're given uniforms, they're trained, fed, housed for all this time. They're shipped at great government expense over to North America. And then if they take off, if they run away, the government's lost a huge investment. And so desertion was regarded as a very serious crime.
For decades, common British women followed their husbands into battle and on campaigns. The War of 1812 was no exception. During the war, the British Army allowed a certain amount of women to follow their husbands into the barracks, where they would live amongst the militia. Life in the barracks was particularly difficult for women. They saw their husbands march off to battle, not knowing if they would ever come back.
Well, considering that the ratio of women to men was something like 6 to 100, according to the regulation, over the years, if a regiment was in barracks for a long period of time, there would actually be more women than that. There could be up to 50% women in the barracks, but still, that's a pretty marginalized group of people. And for women, it would have been, for anyone, it wouldn't have been pleasant living in the barracks. If your husband happened to not come back from a battle or from a campaign, you were pretty much left to your own devices.
The Army would permit 6 men per company. Each regiment had 10 companies. Normally about 60 men in a company. So for about every 60 men, 6 of them were allowed to be married and have their wives and children live in barracks with them. It's the same proportion of women that would be transported from point A to point B. For those women who were able to come and live in barracks with their husbands, and they were given a berth in barracks, the women were given a bunk in the men's barracks. There was no privacy necessarily. Their children were not given beds. The wife got half rations, half a pound of meat and half a pound of bread per day. The women in barracks were expected to show respect to the officers and the non-commissioned officers, not to curse, not to drink, and so on, and were able to earn a little bit of extra money by washing the soldiers' shirts and sheets. I think the attitude of women towards the War of 1812 would have reflected exactly the same attitude as men at the time. That when the Americans invaded, there were a number of people that were recent American immigrants, actually. There were people living in Upper Canada who had been born and brought up in the United States, had only been here a couple of years, but when Upper Canada was invaded, they fought viciously against their former countrymen.
Like women, African Americans' contribution to the War of 1812 is heavily overlooked by much of the historical community.
But what most people don't realize when they're looking into this is that about 10% of Upper Canada at the time of the War of 1812 was of African descent. And they, along with their white compatriots, every man between 16 and 60 had to be part of the militia.
The movement for a unified Aboriginal Confederacy, led by Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh, was a movement intending to minimize Native cultural devastation in the wake of America's brutal expansionist plans. These ambitious leaders saw the need to preserve the Aboriginal race and their ways of life, and they attempted to do so by bringing First Nations of all tribes together, unifying them through a single cause.
Tecumseh was a Shawnee leader, diplomatic and war leader, And with his half-brother, Tenskwatawa, who is someone we always forget, formed a confederacy beginning about 1805 in the west of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, that region. And the objective of the confederacy was to unite Native people to prevent the further loss of their land against American expansion. At first, they did not seek a military solution, they sought diplomatic solutions. But when they didn't work, they increasingly turned towards hostility. And in fact, war between the Western Confederacy and the United States broke out in November 1811, several months before the Anglo-American War broke out. The problem with the Confederacy, though, is that in 1813, it collapsed after the Battle of Moraviantown, which was an American victory, and Tecumseh was killed, and Tenskwatawa lost much of his influence. And at that point, some of the Native people negotiated peace with the Americans. Others remained hostile. So Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's importance in terms of Canadian defense was critical towards the beginning of the war. Their own dream, though, of creating a Native homeland in the old northwest of Michigan and related regions was not achieved.
Well, Americans fighting Native forces back then, there were those who grew up on the East Coast who'd never seen a Native person before. And again, back to this crazy, irrational propaganda put out by both sides, that they really had no idea what they were going to confront. But there were enough American military commanders who had served on the frontier, who in some cases, and this might kind of confuse some people, that because they lived with Native people, they got along with Native people. Some of them learned some of the language. They seemed to understand a lot of the cultural practices. So the idea that the Americans were constantly attacking the natives isn't entirely true. And there were some Americans who were trying to communicate and try to negotiate with natives. But the US was growing at 10 times the rate of Canada. We still have about 1/10 the population of the United States. So that was going to bring those two cultures into conflict at a much faster rate.
It's important not to talk about British military tactics, but about Western military tactics. The American military tactics in the War of 1812 were identical to British military tactics.
European warfare was simple scorekeeping. You stood in a battle line and you blazed away at each other, and whoever blinked first or backed away first lost. So we probably looked pretty uncivilized to them in the way we conducted warfare.
The line troops tended to fight in standing up, shoulder to shoulder, 2 ranks deep with their British, 3 ranks deep with their American, in a way that to us seems odd. But when you think of the weapons they used, weapons only had a limited range, were not very accurate, and didn't work all the time. And therefore, to make the weapons effective, they relied on these very tight formations of troops that fired massed volleys into the enemy that would be devastating, would win the battle. And these line troops, whether the Americans in blue or the British in red, were the bulk of infantry, and they were the troops who won the big battles that really counted. However, another part of the infantry were the light infantry, and these people sometimes wore camouflage, and they'd spread out and hide in the bushes and stuff the way we would think people should fight. And these people would do things like move ahead of the line infantry and protect them from enemy troops hiding behind the trees and in the bushes and that sort of thing. And they were important, but they didn't have the firepower to win the big battles. But all armies had a balance of these line troops and light troops. American mythology sort of has the British all as line troops, the Americans all as light troops, hiding behind the trees and picking them all off, and it's just not true. Native people fought like light troops. They fought by taking cover in small groups, in a more individualistic way, and this suited them because an individual in combat had a big role in trying to demonstrate to his friends how good a warrior he was. Whereas in the white armies fighting for, say, the honor of the regiment would be more important, which would suppress individualistic action to some degree.
By the end of the war, the American troops are being ambushed and sniped at by the locals. So if the US Army was showing up in town, local Canadians were suddenly showing up in numbers to shoot at them to protect their own farms and families. So if you want a motivation to fight, you can't think of a better one probably than someone actually defending their own home from soldiers. So The reception they thought they were going to receive turned out to be different than the reality of it.
As far as the United States goes, they felt that their sovereignty was being violated on the high seas, their sovereignty was being violated as they were expanding westward, and with the end of the War of 1812 and the Treaty of Ghent, the British would no longer interfere with American westward expansion, and they wouldn't interfere with American commerce on the high seas. They would respect American sovereignty.
The War of 1812, of course, is enormously important in Canadian history because, of course, the successful British defense of Canada meant that the Canadian experiment in building a North American society continued. It was not brought to a violent and premature end through American conquest. And if you live in Toronto, for example, you live in a different city than it would be if it had been conquered. We might be living in a city much more like Buffalo or Rochester, for example, than the city in which we live. So we actually owe a lot to the successful defense of Canada in 1812 in terms of us having a distinct and, I think, a very comfortable society in which to live.
If the Americans had been successful and added what's now Ontario to the United States, what would have happened to Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta? Like all the Western territories would have also been added to the Union. And what a different place Canada would be today, if it even existed at all, if it had not been for those guys in red coats and their Aboriginal allies who, stood in a line against these incredible, overwhelming numbers, and through their superior training were able to successfully defend the place. So, and then from an American point of view, when we were talking about before, the fact that it really was like a second American War of Independence, that even though they didn't achieve their goal of the capture or conquest of Upper Canada, they were able to express their sovereignty and finally be recognized as a sovereign nation by the European powers. And for both those reasons, it really should be a major, major commemoration. So people should be aware of how important that was, and people should really embrace the 200 years of peace that we've had since. That's, what other two countries sharing such a long border haven't had a war in 200 years against each other? That's pretty rare.